Ray Stokes is quite an institution at Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine. He was the young college's first employee, and he went to work even before the doors were opened in 1969. He has worn several titles over the last 19 years, but right now he's curator of special collections in the Health Sciences Library and is secretary-treasurer of the Alumni Association. So you've had a very interesting life up until now, right?
Oh, you think so?
I think so, yes.
Who you been talking to?
I've done this before.
I see.
Tell us a little bit about what your career before you got to TCOM. Just a little bit.
Just a little bit? Well, of course, it's a little more than a little bit. I'll try to narrow it down. But I was with the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, grew up there in circulation, worked in circulation, went into World War II. A misdirected classification officer made me a correspondent because I was a newspaper man. So I went into PR and later got a what they call a combat correspondence warrant in the Marine Corps. And so naturally I liked what I was doing. When I came back to the Star-Telegram, went back to work in circulation, I tried to get transferred into the editorial department, and of course they laughed at me, and I don't blame them. I didn't have any background. I'd taken the little journalism in high school, and that was about it. So I made up my mind that I would give up the job I had there at Star-Telegram and start the TCU, and I opened up a little advertising agency, mainly selling specialty advertising. I did a little ad work, but mainly specialty advertising, and went to TCU, got my degree in journalism, but I never did actually use it to any great extent, other than eventually I went into a little advertising business, and I majored in publishing newsletters for people who couldn't do it themselves. So that was the extent of my journalism career, so to speak. And then I later got in the oil business. Stayed in that about 16 years. And then my church needed someone to represent or to fulfill a job that was vacant down in Georgetown, and so I went down there without any background in health welfare work, but that's what it amounted to. I was administrator of a home for the aging, known as the Wesleyan, there in Georgetown for 6 years. And when I returned to Fort Worth, I came back to Fort Worth to actually get in the apartment. I was back in the early 60s, or not early 60s, late 60s. And I had an idea I wanted to become an apartment owner. Thank goodness I wasn't. But it was during that particular time that I noticed a friend of mine just happened to mention that said the osteopaths. Well, I knew a little bit about the word osteopath because I'd had some identity with them prior to that. I'd met one or two, and I knew how to spell the word, so I guess that's where I eventually got the job because of that. But
yeah, you ran for the legislature once.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, 1950, when I was a senior out at TCU, I got the idea that I wanted to be a great statesman, you know. And so I ran for state representative in place 4. In those days, they only had 5 representatives in Tarrant County. They had the 4 places and a fortorial that took care of served both Denton and Tarrant County. So I ran in place 4, and I had a little motto, a little slogan. It says, whether your name be Astor or plain Joe Dokes, the man for your representative is C. Ray Stokes. Now, see, Charles is my first name, but I seldom ever use it, except when they make me, you see. But I lost. That's right. That's right. Back in those days, when you had a C in front or initial in front of your name, that was a no-no. That was like a buzz, you know, when somebody ran for president. Dewey, I guess it was Dewey that ran for president with the mustache, and that's why he lost being president. But anyhow, so, but during that particular campaign, I was called by an osteopathic physician by the name of Danny Byer, who officed out on bond, and I knew, like I say, I knew nothing about the osteopathic profession, but he wanted to kind of pick my brain to see how I stood on what my opinion was, because they were getting ready to vote on the basic science bill at that time in the legislature, and he wanted to get my feelings on how I stood or didn't stand. So he asked me to come into his office, and we had a nice little visit. And when I got ready to leave, he said, "Now, there are no strings whatsoever. You do as you please, but if you win, we hope you will understand our profession and give our side a reasonable consideration." But and then he handed me a $50 bill, and that was the only contribution that I got outside of a little gift from my dentist friend. But anyhow, I ran a pretty good third in the 4-man race, but I never tried it again.
Yeah, and who was the second in the race?
Second in the race was a man by the name of Wills. He was an elderly gentleman, about 84 years old, had never run for public office before in his life. And he got second and got killed 2 days before the election.
And you still lost it.
And I still lost. That's right.
That's a wonderful story.
So anyhow, that was my short experience in politics.
But you got introduced to Danny Byers.
I got introduced to Danny Byers.
It was not a complete loss.
And that was 1950, so some 19 years later, I was in his office again doing an interview. In other words, he was one of 3 doctors, who founded TCOM, got their charter back in June 15th, 1966. They sent Abe Herman, who was their attorney, down, and he used pretty well TCU's charter as an outline.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, he did. And went down to Austin, got a very broad-based perpetual charter, and came back out. I think the MDs weren't aware that he was there because nobody gave him any problem whatsoever. And came back. Of course, they didn't do anything with their charter.
Well, that's what I was going to say. What happened from 66 to 69?
Well, from 66 to 68, nothing. But in 68, at a meeting that they had a state convention, what is now called Texas Osteopathic Medical Association, met in Houston for the annual meeting, and they started a campaign drive, fundraising, and they got about $100,000 in pledges from, possibly, at that time there weren't more than 650, 700 DOs in the state. And I expect they had maybe some 200 who had made some type of pledge. And so they had the $100,000 pledge and $10,000 in the bank, but they hadn't done anything what they should have done right at that time, TK. Of course, I wouldn't have been involved if they'd have done what I'm proposing they should have done. They should have hired a fundraising expert of some sort, some sort of PR front or something to have gotten to do a feasibility study at that time, rather than waiting some over a year and a half, almost 2 years before I came along and they employed me. And like I say, I did sort of a feasibility study to see if there's any possibility of us raising. We were trying to raise $1 million. We never did quite raise the exact $1 million, but we got pretty close to it.
Well, tell us about you getting hired. Who hired
getting
you?
hired?
Yeah.
Well, I first had an interview with Dr. George Lubel, who was the chairman of the board, and basically the founder, so to speak, although there were 3 founders. But
were they the board?
There was one more. That was the original board, but then about a year later they did add one more. They added they called him a chairman of house and grounds. Although they didn't have any grounds and they certainly didn't have any house, but that was his title. That's Dr. John Burnett. Yes, who practiced over in Dallas, and he was on the board. So there was actually a 4-man board, although Dr. John left it entirely up to the executive committee, so to speak, who actually employed me. So I had an interview with Dr. Lubel first. Then he sent me to both Carl Everett, who was practicing out on Camp Bowie at the time, and then Dr. Byer, whose office I hadn't been back in 19 years, but he was still there and practicing the same location.
Did he remember you?
Yes, he said he did. He said he did, yes. And so in spite of my weak points, I got the job.
Well, what was the job?
What was the job?
What was the title and what was your
Director of
first?
Development. That was my title.
Okay, and what?
Director of Development.
What did they say do first?
First thing to do was they handed me which was not a valid letter, it was just a copy. They had received a letter of intent from a very prominent family here in Fort Worth, the name of Walsh, Howard Walsh, the family, who had a great deal of land out in northwest Fort Worth. Now, I've never been able to find out exactly how we got the letter of intent in the first place. I never did get anyone. I'm sure Dr. Lubel at some given time might be able to come up with that answer, but I'm not certain as to how we got the letter of intent, because there was certainly no arm twisting done on our part, anything of that. I'm certain there wasn't. So they had this letter of intent that they got, but they sat on that too long. In other words, I'm sure they wrote a letter of appreciation and said we will comply a certain length of time, but after some length of time
Well, do you know
passed.
when they got the letter of intent?
Well, they got the letter of intent in 1967.
Wow.
See, so they'd had it for they'd had it for 2 years. See, but prior to my being employed, I'm not certain of the date, but sometime in February or March, I was hired in April. So just a short time before I was hired, a month, 6 weeks, they got a letter from the Walsh family that they had withdrawn their offer. So that was my assignment, to try to get that reinstated, to get them to reconsider and to give us the 60 acres of land, which is now the location of the Tarrant County Junior College, TCJC Northwest Campus.
So you didn't do it, is that
I didn't
what you're
do
saying?
it. That's right. I never did get a chance. I got a chance to talk to two of the Walsh's sons, and I got to visit with their attorney, Rice Tilley. That is senior. There's a junior here now, but Rice Tilley senior. I got to his office, but I never was able to. That was my first assignment, and I failed in my first assignment. So that's.
But they let
that
you
was
have
my
the,
record.
They let you take over the books anyway, right?
Oh yes. I
Okay.
had the job. The job, and then of course my main job, of course, was to try to, since it was a private institution, and although I made a concerted effort to get money from people like Ross Perot, for example, I had very little luck.
But you ain't
well, I
tried.
had none. But in other words, I think I spent quite a bit of time with some 18 or 20 foundations, but most of them had never heard of the osteopathic profession, let alone TCOM, which was certainly nothing more than a paper college at the time.
You said there was $100,000 pledged and 10 in the bank. How much of that 100 did you ever see, do you think?
Well, I've got records in my files right now, TK, that if they would honor their pledges, it'd bring in the institution about $25,000 or $30,000.
Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, some of my good friends' names are on that signed pledge that never were honored.
Is that
Yeah,
right? Well, then how did you raise that money you said
Well,
about?
we raised it from some help of there were three foundations that did help us to a great extent in the very beginning. We've got to take our hat off to the efforts that Dr. Lubel made with Katrine Deakins, who was the Secretary-Treasurer, or actually, I don't know what her title was as far as the foundation. She was, Amon Carter's secretary for many years, Ms. Deakins, Katrine Deakins.
But he had a DO for a doctor,
Yes,
right?
well, yeah, Dr. Phil Russell, who passed away in '75, was Amon Carter's physician for many years, and also Katrine's. The Carter Foundation gave, I don't know just how X number of dollars that they had given, about 3 different grants. The Carter Foundation, the Sid Richardson Foundation, and then the J.E. L.E. Maybe Foundation of Tulsa gave, and of course I had a finger in the hand, so to speak, in making that possible, because one of the 5 board members, and that's, you've got to know somebody. You can write all of the proposals you want to, but unless you have somebody to carry that proposal for you, it's rather difficult, because there's just more demand than you can think about as far as requests are concerned.
Especially for a college that didn't even exist
So
yet.
John Cox of the Maybe Foundation here, he lives here in Fort Worth. was instrumental in helping us. So those three foundations helped us along. But one other thing, we had what was known as TCOM Sustainer. Now, although the $100,000 that they had pledged, we went beyond that because we got a lot of money from people who hadn't even pledged. I say a lot, we didn't get a lot, but I mean we got some commitment, we got some interest on various doctors throughout the state who hadn't even been solicited as far as the Houston meeting was concerned. So that's where we stood at that time.
Yeah. And what was the first piece of equipment you bought?
First piece of equipment, I've still got it.
I want to hear about that.
Oh, yes. It's an Underwood typewriter, a regular manual typewriter. And, of course, see, I've been hunting and pecking now for about 50 years. And I'm not a typist, although I've typed a great deal, but by just
two fingers.
Two fingers. Well, I bought that for $60. An odd little sidebar to that was that here about a year ago, now this can't be proved, I'm sure, but and I don't know who would follow through and do what this man said, but the fellow who repaired it, cleaned it, said when he brought it back, he said, you know, that's quite an old typewriter you've got. I said, yeah, about 1940, 41 model. He said, you could take that now on the market, it's worth $1,500.
Goodness.
And I was telling Dorothea in the inventory that the other day. She said, well, she better change her records because she's already written it off for the books.
Right.
But I'm still using the $60 typewriter.
Well, you've done lots of newsletters on it, right? You were the first employee.
Right.
And wasn't Edna the second?
Yes, my wife was the second. I was hired on the 15th of April in '69, and 2 weeks later, I put her to work as my secretary.
Okay, so you hired her.
Yeah,
okay.
Right. I hired her. Okay. Well, I had the blessing of the board, but they didn't have any restrictions on my hiring my wife. There was no nepotism involved at that time. I mean, it didn't amount to anything, at least. Our first office was one that never mentioned. Our first office, and we stayed there from May 1 to the following February, some 6 or 8 months, was 1500 West 5th Street, which, incidentally, I lived at 1500 West 5th when I was a kid, a two-story apartment house. But
this was a different building?
Oh,
the
yes.
Same location?
The same location. It's the Summit building now. Yeah. There at Penn and, or Summit and where Penn and Summit come together there on 5th Street, right across from the First Baptist Church, right across the street. So that's where we stayed there 1500 until we moved out to a little house out here at Madison and Montgomery, 3600 Madison. We call it the Little White House.
Your office moved or you and Edna moved?
Well, everything moved. At that time, we had hired Dr. Henry Hart, who was our first dean. So the three of us moved out to 3600. Well, three of us for several months. We occupied a little 10 by 10 office space on 5th Street.
Well, now, how did Henry Hart come into this picture?
Well, that was my second assignment.
Oh, okay.
That was my second assignment.
Better
I was a little more successful in my second assignment. My second assignment was, Dr. Lubel told me one day, he says, Ray, I want you to find us a dean. That's all. He didn't give me any directions or anything, just find us a dean. So I got to thinking, well, Jerome Moore, Dr. Moore out at TCU, who was dean of the Adrad College, and he was my dean when I was in school, knew him fairly well. I'd covered him on my beat when I was on the skiff.
Oh, I knew him too.
Yeah. So anyhow, my first thought was to go out and pick his brain and see if he could give me some leads. So I went in to see Dr. Moore, and after I sat down and told him what I was there for, I was looking for a dean, and I came to him for some direction or some suggestions. It wasn't 10 seconds until he, as if he were anticipating the question, he said, if you can get him, get Henry Hart.
Wow.
And that's and he didn't have any other to offer. He had a few accolades to throw in Dr. Hart's direction, but he said, if you can get him, he'll make you a fine qualified dean.
Was he already retired?
Well, I was fortunate. We were fortunate. We certainly were fortunate because he had retired from TCU in '68, I believe it was, and then spent '69, 1 year, down at Jarvis Christian College down at Hawkins, down in East Texas. He didn't sign but 1 year contract. So I caught him, I believe it was July or August of '69, and he was in between contracts. He hadn't made up his mind whether or not he would go back down to Jarvis. So he had no commitment. He was free. So I invited him out to lunch. At that time, over at the Malek Tower, they were serving a very nice buffet lunch there in the lobby of the building. So my wife and I had him over for lunch one day. I knew Dr. Hart because when I was at the Wesleyan home, he came over to talk to me one time about his sister who lived in a retirement home over in Kerrville. And he wanted to get her transferred over to the Wesleyan if he could. And I had met him. Of course, I knew Dr. Hart by reputation when I was out at TCU, but I didn't know him personally. And I wasn't a chemistry major, so I didn't have any occasion to really know him personally. But I did know him through a little bit of Methodist. He's also a very active Methodist layman, or was, and I knew him that way, but didn't know him professionally.
Well, now, that same summer, didn't you and Edna tour some other osteopathic schools?
Yes. We, when, that was back, well, actually, it was in July of '69, made a trip up to Kirksville. That's where I first met Dr. Willard, who later became our boss. But he was a dean at Kirksville at the time. Dr. Luba was getting ready to attend. He was very active. He was on the board of trustees of the AOA, the American Osteopathic Association. And they were meeting that year, having their summer session in Chicago. So at the Drake Hotel, and that's where he made reservations for us. But he told us to meet him there, and he'd introduce me around. I even had the good fortune to attend some presidents' meetings and deans' meetings as an observer only, because we still were just a paper college and certainly didn't know would have any future.
Well,
but in the meantime, I went from Kirksville up to, I stopped at Kansas City first. Got acquainted with Kansas City. Dr. Wilbur Cole, who's a very active in osteopathic, the writings of manipulative medicine, has written several papers and books and so forth. He was the dean at the time. He gave me a very fine reception. Then I went on into Kirksville, had a very fine audience there. Dr. Thompson was the president, and Willard was the dean. And although Dr. Thompson didn't want to share too much information with me because he realized that if we opened up a college in Texas, it'd be a little more difficult for him to raise funds in Texas. But he was very kind about it, very considerate. Then I went on into Des Moines and visited there, and they were without a president at the time I was there. Somebody was acting. I didn't get very well acquainted there. And then all into Chicago, went out to Chicago College. Got there a day ahead of the meeting. So, and then I came back and made a kind of a formal report of what I had observed.
That was almost all the osteopathic colleges at the time.
Well, yes, there were only 6.
Okay.
Well, there were 5 that had been in business quite some time, and Michigan opened up 1 year ahead of us. They opened up in that fall. In fact, I met my counterpart, who was a fellow named Barnett, who had been the director of development for the Michigan College, Michigan Osteopathic College, for 12 years before they got it off the ground. So looking back in retrospect, we had a little better track record than that.
So you took this trip to the convention. Then you came back and hired Dr. Hart?
Yes, a short time after that. In the meantime, a rather interesting episode that I had 2 weeks after I was employed. See, 15th of April, along about the 3rd or 4th of May that year, they had their annual state convention, the Texas Osteopathic Medical Association, met in Dallas. And I had 2 weeks to get a banner made, some placards, slogan, some signs printed, and we had a little booth, kind of more of just a couple of tables and a chair than anything else, but I had to come up with a goal. We had 6 goals. I can't remember them verbatim, but I published had a little card printed with the goals of TCOM. And looking back in retrospect, I think we have reached all those goals.
Is that right? Well,
yeah, at this given time. Sure we have. So, but like I say, it was rather interesting, and that was when I first met. There were 7 members on the board at that time, on the TCOM board, and they had a joint meeting between the TOMA board of trustees and our board of directors. Now, they never were in it. They weren't boards of regents, and they weren't trustees. They were directors. It was board of directors, and there were 7 when I was employed.
Okay, there were the 3 founders.
3 founders and 4 others that were scattered around the state, including like John Burnett in Dallas and
Wayne Stokes?
George. Well, no, Wayne came on later. He was about number 9 or 10. When we became a state institution in '75, we had 14 directors.
Oh, okay.
The charter said 3 to 20. In other words, they could go from 3 to anywhere between 3 and 20 directors was part of their charter.
About this time, was that when the Vandergrift family in Arlington?
Well, yes, it was about this time. It
gift?
was actually in the summer of 1970. Dr. Bobby Smith, who was president of TOMA at that time, was a pretty good friend of Tommy Vandergrift. And Bobby Smith, he's not given as much credit as he ought to be given for us being here today, actually, because he did a lot of work and behind-the-scenes work, going to Austin, appearing before committees and that sort of thing. It proved to be very fruitful later on, but he wasn't on our board. He was president of the state association, and as a friend of Tommy Vandergrift, he talked Tommy into giving us 50 acres of land. Now, I don't say this in any wrong to be misinterpreted or anything. Of course, I guess the Hooker Vandergrift, who's Tommy's father, and Carlisle Craven, who was a local, he's deceased now, but he was a Fort Worth attorney. The 2 owned a bunch of, quite a bit of acreage down in South Arlington, which was way out in no man's land in those days, but now it's all pretty well occupied or built up now. But it was on Matlock and Pollyweb Road, which is, if you know where 20 comes through there now in South Arlington, about a mile south of where 20 and Matlock Road intersect now. But, you know, they had a madness in their method. They gave us the 50 acres of land. Of course, the provision in it, though, stipulation was that we had to build on it. We couldn't do anything. We couldn't sell it. We couldn't use it for any other purpose other than to build a medical school on the property, 50 acres. But they owned all the land from the city limits of Arlington all the way south, including that. And they knew we had to have utilities down there, see? So they'd get utilities through their land to get to ours. So that was the madness in their method. No, I say that facetiously, but because they were very philanthropical about it and very benevolent. But we kept that land for about 18 months. And I know it was about Christmas time, I guess, of '72, that Dr. Lubel got a call from Tommy. It was right near the end of the year, and they wanted to do something. And so he called Dr. Lubel and said, "Are you actually going to ever do anything with the land?" And Dr. Lubel said, "Well, I just can't answer that question, but we don't have anything planned. We haven't been able to find anybody to help us raise enough money, and we would have had to have 20 or 25 million to have done any good, you see. So we hadn't been able to really, I'm not looking back now. At the time, we thought we were working pretty hard for it, but I guess maybe we weren't. Because I guess in the back of everybody's mind, they were thinking more about this particular location, without saying so, saying so. But I mean, it was pretty well established that they wanted to be close to a hospital. And if we'd built out in Arlington, we were 18 miles, about 20 miles from this hospital, and 18 miles from one over in Dallas. So I don't know what would have developed, because we weren't going to build a hospital.
But that Vandergrift land turned out to be pretty valuable to us anyway.
Oh, man alive. I tell you, I was a so-called business manager at the time, and that's another hat that didn't fit too well, but still, nevertheless, I guess I qualified at the time. That was before computers, so I made it fairly well.
You could add to the
just the bookkeeping process. But no, we valued it. 50 acres is $6,000 an acre. That's $500,000. $300,000. I can't even add, see? So $300,000. I used that $300,000. I used that $300,000 on paper, shifting it around as liquid assets and so forth. In fact, that's what got us our provisional guarantee, or not provisional from the, what am I trying to say? Provisional from the AOA, not charter, but provisional accreditation. That's the word I'm trying to find. Accreditation. We were given provisional accreditation by the board on the 9th of July. I remember that date in 1970 when the AOA board was meeting in Atlanta, Georgia. And it was because of that $300,000. We had some land, we had some property, you see. So they went ahead and gave us provisional accreditation.
You were about to say you wanted to give credit to some people.
Yes, I think that there's some politicians that ought to receive some credit line, so to speak, because we had some real good, strong, solid help. Now, of course, we think back today, we don't go much farther back than Betty Andahar, who was a senator, who was very instrumental and very helpful. Even though her husband is and was an MD, they were very, very good friends at the school, and she did all she could do as a state representative or senator. But, and we think of Gib Lewis, who's the present Speaker of the House, very forceful and very helpful. And a very strong ally of the school. But going prior to those individuals, we had a couple of, or three, one named Bill Hilton, who's, no, his name was Hilmer, not Hilton, Bill Hilmer, who's now deceased. He was a legislator from Texas, from Fort Worth. But the one that I give credit for there two. Don Kennard, Don Kennard was a state senator. Don Kennard and Cordell Hull. Those two individuals, as much as you can say about who is responsible or who made the contribution, I wouldn't say they made the most, but they made the initial. They made it strong enough to where it was lasting, and it was easy for Betty Andahar and Gib Lewis to follow up on what they had already done. So they made some remarkable imprints.
Did Tom Creighton have much to do with it?
Well, yes. Tom was a good friend. Yeah, he really was. He was a senator over in Mineral Wells, joining senator. But yeah, he was on our team. He really was, and then we had some help, of course, from the coordinating board. They were helpful.
So the second year, the campus had your little office, the bowling alley, and the library over at Fort Worth Osteopathic.
Yeah.
And how long was it then before the brothel shut down or the beer joints shut down? Did they not shut down until the building was about to be raised at the corner?
Well, pretty close. In other words, the apartment complex, the Coronado apartment complex, we bought that in the spring of actually, we didn't buy that till we bought it in like January, February 1975, just a little while before we actually came state. We had acquired everything that we owned at that time that we turned over to the state the following August.
How much of the block did you own by the time the state?
We owned it all.
The whole block?
Yeah, we owned the whole block. That is north side facing south.
Yeah, right, okay.
The odd side of the street.
Where Mary and Coy?
Oh, the even side. Excuse me. I'm
Yeah, that's right.
3516
Okay,
was was our official address.
Yeah, Carter wouldn't appreciate that, would he?
No, they wouldn't.
Mary and Coy was the first president. Now,
Yes.
Where did he come from?
Well, he was president of AOA back in 71. He was a GP in Jackson, Tennessee, from 30 some odd years. Good friend of Dr. Lubel. Dr. Coy was not an administrator. He was a good physician, and he didn't do us any harm. But I'm telling it like I saw it.
Sure.
And I don't mean any disrespect to Dr. Coy, because I guess he served a good purpose, but he was not a strong president. But nevertheless, I guess he did what was expected of him enough to where the board was satisfied with his delivery and his output.
Did they ever consider making Henry Hart the president?
No, I don't think so, because Dr. Hart was he had his career behind him. In other words, he had far more of a past than he had a future.
Yeah, right.
And he had determined that he would only stay until the first class graduated.
Oh, wow.
And so he
That's what he
retired.
did.
Yeah, he stayed. Of course, Dr. Hart, I feel like I'm being a little subjective in saying this, of course. It's kind of hard to be otherwise, but Dr. Hart wasn't given I don't feel like he was given the consideration that he should have been given, but some reason or other, he got along with Dr. Coy, but they weren't on the same level they should have been. I don't feel like, as far as their relationship was concerned, although they never had any trouble or anything of that nature. But Dr. Coy never would give Dr. Hart any particular assignment. Dr. Coy came here as the dean.
To take over after Henry Hart left?
No. Dr. Hart was still here. In other words, he became the dean and chief operating officer, or chief executive, and Dr. Hart just had his title changed. He became sort of an all-purpose vice president, VP. See, in other words, that's what it amounted to. But he was not the chief operating officer.
Or the dean anymore.
Or the dean anymore.
Oh, okay.
And they came along and hired another individual as the dean. And Ed, what was his name? Goodness alive, he's up in Maine now. Ed knew. I knew I'd forget somebody's name.
I don't know.
Well, for goodness sakes alive, he was here about 2-3 years. He was our dean. Newell. Ed Newell. Ed Newell. I knew it'd come to me. But Dr. Ed Newell, he was the dean, and he was a fine fellow, and he did all he could do. He felt like that, in other words, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but he was the dean, and Dr. Coy was made president. See, he was made president by our board of directors. He was dean from February. Of course, he was hired in February 1972. He came to work in August. So he was hired back before his term expired as AOA president. So a little interim there between the time he gave up that assignment and became our chief executive officer as dean in August of 1972. Just before Christmas of that year, he was made president.
Okay.
There was no inauguration, no pomp or no particular extra curricular activities or anything. He was just declared president. And he
really stayed president until we were no longer a private institution.
And so he's known today as the founding president of TCOM.
And his title just kind of disintegrated after.
He stayed on here as a consultant for a while to Jitter Nolan, the president of NTSU TCOM.
Who made the first contact for affiliation with North Texas? Do you know how that came about?
Yeah, I sure do. We were told by Dr. Brindley, I can't remember his initials, but he was on the coordinating board at the time. He was chairman at the time. He is, I believe he's a pathologist down at Scott and White, even today. He's got years. But he may still be on the coordinating board. I don't know for sure about that. But Dr. Brindley was, he came up a couple of times and visited, made suggestions and so forth. And one of the conferences that we had at that time, he made the suggestion that we would never get off of first base. Might get to first base, but we'd never get off of first base if we didn't become affiliated in some way with an institution of higher learning, some university in this area. So our thoughts immediately turned to North Texas, to UTA
Oh, yeah?
at Arlington. Well, you see, we were given some land over there, you see, and we were thinking about that. So naturally, but at that given time, I don't remember the name, but the president of UTA was an MD. So we never made quite the connection that I don't think they ever even had an official meeting or anything of that nature. Then we considered TCU, Texas Christian. Now, I don't know what was ever done in that respect. I didn't have privy to some of the meetings that they had out at the Colonial Country Club. Dr. Lubel and Dr. Everett and Dr. Byer and Dr. Hart met on a few occasions with various interested people and so forth, and they'd have dinner and discuss the possibilities. So I really don't know just exactly how it came about. But while they were doing all this talking, the UTA, TCU, Dr. Bob Nobles, who was a practicing GP at Denton, had been the president of TOMA, along about the time Lubel and Everett and Byer were getting the charter. And he was very interested in TCOM and was a good, strong contributor to the financial support of the school. Dr. Bob Noble had graduated from North Texas and had gotten pretty well acquainted with Jeter Nolan. And he knew Dr. Sylvie, who was Dean of Basic Sciences, I believe. And he went to his dean on a given occasion and said, we're having a meeting out in Hawaii. AOA being we, forgive me. AOA is having its annual meeting in Hawaii. I'd like for you to come out and talk to us. Because Dr. Sylvie confessed he didn't know anything about osteopathy. He was a good scientist and that sort of thing, but he knew very little about it. He had an open mind, although he would be the first to confess that he was rather prejudiced to begin with, but then he tried to maintain an open mind, and so he was invited out to make some presentation to the AOA and to learn a little bit more about the operations of what the AOA was all about. And then when he came back, Noble thought it was nothing but apropos that they have some kind of a little meeting with some of our board members to kind of fill Dr. Sylvie in and bring him up to date on what our desires were as far as becoming affiliated with some institution. So I think the men that I just mentioned a minute ago having meetings out at Colonial, Dr. Lewell, his board or his executive committee, met with Dr. Bob Nobles and Sylvie and Jenner Nolan, who was president of North Texas. Sylvie had gone and reported to Nolan, and Nolan wanted a medical school. He wanted a medical school, but he wanted an allopathic school if he could get it, of course. But he realized he wasn't going to be successful in that, and consequently...
Why was that? Because there was one in Dallas?
Right,
Yeah.
right. And then, and another thing, at that given time, Dr. Quinn, I think his name was, up at Texas Woman's College, Texas Woman's University, TWU. He was very determined to have a medical school too. And
Did he ever want us?
no, he didn't want us. No.
Okay. In those days, did they envision the kind of affiliation we've got now? Is that what they wanted?
Well, yes, I guess it is, because they got what they wanted. Because some people wondered why we didn't become North Texas State University College of Osteopathic Medicine.
Yeah.
So,
Why
yeah, I
didn't
mean,
it, you know?
just a college. Well, mainly, I think because of the forerunners that had worked so hard in the legislature to make us an independent institution, own our own autonomy, plus the insistence that began to emanate from TOMA, in being certain that a DO was even head of the school, president, and that sort of thing. It was just that, and finally they passed a bill to that degree, but that was later on, of course. But rather than becoming just a college of North Texas, the concerted effort, and of course there were a number of men on our board who felt the same way, that we would like to become affiliated and identified, and they had no objection to serving under the same Board of Regents or even serving under the same president, but not a part of North Texas State University per se. That's not a very good answer, but it's the best I have to my knowledge, because it was just they were jockeying for position and looking down the road as to where we would be. And at that time, a gentleman by the name of Tex Roberts, who was the executive director of TOMA, was very strongly opposed for some reason or other. I never did get any clarification on it, the reason, but he was very much opposed to North Texas, even being involved. And
did he think we could make it on our own?
He must have, although I never heard him say that, but his actions alluded to that.
So that was the resistance to the affiliation?
Yes. Well, and then there was a lot of resistance there at North Texas.
Oh, okay.
Oh, heavens, I bet you. Well, they didn't want to touch us with a 10-foot pole. Now, when I'm talking about I'm speaking of the major, the lesser administrators, and all of the faculty, the faculty particularly.
But Jitter Nolan did want it.
He did want it. Now, I don't know just how gung-ho he was in the beginning, of course, but after having several meetings with George Lubel and Everett and Beyer and Sylvia, Sylvia was instrumental, and a fellow by the name of Gus Foray, who was also, I've forgotten what his title was up at North Texas, but he was sort of an assistant to the president. I mean, he did a lot of work that Jitter didn't want to do himself. He did it for Jitter. He came from TCU with Jitter when they were both at TCU, and Dr. Foray.
So the three of them sort of did it, is that?
That's right. Sylvia and Foray and Nolan were certainly the ones that really wanted it as far as North Texas was concerned. And then, of course, the members down here were very interested in the affiliation. But
so when was Jitter Nolan president of TCOM2?
He was president of TCOM the day that we became a state institution. Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. First day of September. 1975. And until he resigned in 79, I guess it was, when he got in a little controversy over robbing Peter to pay Paul, or whatever it was they did up there. But nevertheless, and I'm not implying that he did anything wrong. Nothing at all. It's just a matter of politics.
Yeah, right. You've had a number of offices, physical offices, not titles I'm talking about right now.
Yeah.
Do you remember where they all were?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Okay,
well,
you had
I started at 1500 West 5th Street.
Right.
Then I came to 3600 Madison. Then I went up to the little garage apartment.
That's right, okay.
See? Then I went down to the little office in the back of the basic science building, and in back of one of the labs, had cut off one of the labs and put a little office in there. And then I moved to a little house that we owned right behind the garage apartment. I mean, not the garage apartment, right behind the, actually it was kind of in between, behind the garage, the apartment complex and the bowling alley.
Okay, that's fine.
It was also a little white house, and I stayed there. Then I moved down to the old bank building, you know, the West Side State Bank. It was down on the, right across, right next to the Tower Theater down there.
Okay, when was that?
That tower, 7th Street Theater, 7th Street Theater. Well, I was in there from 1977 to 70, let's see.
Oh, was that on 6th Street?
No, 7th Street.
7th Street.
7th Street.
Okay.
6th Street now is where I think the local bank is, where the bank is now. And I was there from 1977 to, I guess, latter part of 78, because it was 1st of January 1979. No, wait a minute. 1978, forgive me. Because the reason I remember was I was told, of all places, in the men's room in a hotel in Atlanta, Georgia, along about the middle of November 1977, during a meeting of the American Osteopathic Association that I was attending, I was told by Dr. Willard, who was the dean at that time and our chief executive officer, that in essence, I was being demoted. That's what it amounted to. Of course, I didn't lose anything or anything of that nature. It just kind of had my feelings hurt a little, you know. But I didn't lose any money or anything of that nature. In fact, I think they might even give me a little raise, but they sometimes do that, you know. But I was told that they had selected a new director of development. See, let me go back just a piece. When we became a state institution, up at that time, I was director of development and public relations. Well, of course, we had to change the name public relations to public information when we became a state institution. So I had an associate by the name of Burley McAllister, who became a married fellow named Edwards, became Burley Edwards. But Burley came to me. She was a graduate of North Texas. She became my assistant. And she was an assistant. She never. We had a secretary later, but the two of us worked together for a while, and then we finally talked them into getting a secretary for both of us. But my job was cut in half. Jitter Nolan, one of the first things he did was remove me from PR altogether. And the only quarrel that I had with Jitter Nolan and the system was, instead of making her the director of public information, they made her coordinator under the director, which happened to be at that time Janice Odom, up in North Texas. I had no quarrel with anybody except that I just felt like she should, we were supposed to be, we weren't under North Texas. We weren't under North Texas. And I kept trying to remind Doctor, see, I answered every day. I picked up the telephone and called Jitter Nolan for assignments. And so did Burley. See, hers in PR and mine in development.
Because he was president of both institutions.
Right, he was president of both institutions. And I didn't go through anybody. I went straight into his private office, or I mean the phone call.
But Burley answered to Janice, and Janice was at North Texas.
That's right, that's right.
Oh, that's
see, and that's the only objection I had. I felt like that Burley should have been given full directorship.
So you were made director of development?
Director, no, director of development. Just in other words, just remove me from any PR work.
Okay,
See,
and then until
development.
the bathroom in Atlanta.
The bathroom in Atlanta, I was director of development. Then I was told that on the 1st of January, a PhD who happened to wear a skirt
I remember her, yes.
was coming down as the director of, so I became her associate. And lasted a little over a year with her. And then fortunately I felt like that I just couldn't be subjected to the situation that arose at that time.
How long was she, this is Pam Hilmer.
Pam Hilmer, that's right.
How long was she?
Dr. Hilmer.
How long was she director of development?
Well, from January 1st, 1978 until, I guess, when was it, 80 or 81? Was it 81 that we went to El Paso? I believe it was 81 that we went to El Paso. I say we again, I'm talking about Toma, had his convention out there, and she was to entertain the House of Delegates for the State Association. And Dr. At that time, Dr. Willard was still just the dean. He hadn't been made president at that time. But she failed to show up out there.
Good.
And she never did. I don't think she formally ever resigned, but she fell in love with somebody by the name of Elkowitz, who was a DO in Brooklyn, and married him.
Wow.
She was married here, but she got a divorce and from her. Hilmer was the fellow's name. And she was a New England girl, or is a New England girl. I guess she's still living in Brooklyn. I haven't heard from her in several years. But she never did resign formally.
So is that when you became special, after that year, you became curator of special collections?
Yeah, well, sure, yeah. That's in other words, I went to Dr. Willard and said, I've had my tummy full. I'm going to have to retire. I wasn't going to resign, I was going to retire. See, I think I was already over 65, but then I was going to retire. So, but he talked me into staying on and made arrangements to have a job half-time in medical education. Of course, now I never did any medical education duties, but I answered to Warren Anderson for a bit, and then I worked with Bobby Carter, and most of my work was in the library, learning something about special collections.
Yeah. Did you finish that list of offices that you started a while ago?
Did I finish the list?
Yeah.
Well, I don't
you?
believe I did. Well, of course, as the case, as the necessity arose, I was a purchasing agent for about 2 years. As director of development, director of public relations, registrar, business manager. I guess that pretty well.
But you were in the bowling alley, and then where did you move?
Well, from the bowling alley, I went to the little house behind the bowling alley.
Okay.
Then I went down to the bank.
The bank.
And then from the bank, I went down to the River Plaza.
River Plaza. Okay, and then over.
Then over on the 7th floor of the Med-Ed 1.
Okay. Yeah. What do you think is your greatest accomplishment for TCOM?
Well, really, of course, it's nice to know that I had a finger in the hand that's made all of this possible, but I guess I'd have to say the luck that I had in negotiating an agreement with Dr. Hart. I feel like what little, of course, I didn't do anything except just follow a man's suggestion, and I did have to do a little selling, and I did have to set up some meetings with the people that actually hired Dr. Hart. I didn't have anything to do with actually employing him, but I was responsible for finding him.
Right.
And I feel like that. And another thing that I feel, one thing that I hadn't mentioned through this process of growth, back in 1973, Dr. Coy was president, and I was still the director of development. We had a good rapport with the Richardson Foundation, and Wilkie was or still is, the executive director. What's his first name? I ought to know it as well as I know mine. But Val Wilkie. Val Wilkie was the executive director and still is. We talked them into a letter of intent for $1 million to buy up all this property around here. We got a letter of intent, another one of those letters, in addition to the one that Kowalski had given for a short time. Dr. Coy and I had a meeting with Val and got a letter, and the letter went to Dr. A copy of it, because it was long about, this was 70, I said 73, it might have even been 74. We were still we were still an independent school, but we did have a very close relationship with North Texas. That started in February 1972 when we entered into a contract, see, as a result of this bill that was passed, Senate Bill 160, and we moved along with our affiliation with North Texas, even though we weren't identified with them other than we were just a subscriber to their services, is what it amounted to, because they agreed to furnish the basic science equipment and faculty and so forth, and we had to transport our students back and forth and so forth, and some of them moved to Denton, but some of them went back and forth on the bus every day. Of course, they taught the basic sciences up there for a couple of years before we became a state institution, you see, and during that particular time, we were trying to get up enough money together to buy up all this property. So Jitter Nolan was involved, although he still wasn't our boss, because I remember Dr. Coy sent Dr. Jitter Nolan a copy of the letter of intent that we got. But that letter too was withdrawn within a very short period of time, and we never were able to determine the reason other than, here and again it's always easy to blame somebody else, but our good friends around here on Tulsa Way, the Tarrant County Medical Society, got word of what was going on. And they put a stop to it by talking to the chairman of the Richardson Foundation, and his name was in the paper just the other day, as very critical of our current Speaker of the House. What's his name? The old gentleman is 90-some-odd years old, and he was Mr. 7th Street, you know, for years and years. President and chairman of the board of the Fort Worth National Bank.
Pace?
No, not Pace. No, the old gentleman. Why can't I call his name? I would have looked it up if I'd have thought about it in advance, but I can't think of his name.
We have to put a P.S. on this. That's interesting.
Yeah, well, anyhow, he's in last Sunday's newspaper. There was a lot of critique on Jim Wright. Wait a minute. Hey, getting Jim Wright. I've got to go back if I can. I got to go back and tell you about one of the other places that we almost opened up our. I'm leaving out the best one.
Okay, tell me about it.
Well, the best one was the 60 acres of land that used to be, we called it the Narcotic Farm, we being the old-timers here in Fort Worth. The Narcotic Farm out on the Mansfield Highway, which is now a correctional institution, a federal penitentiary.
Oh, FCI.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. See, that was the old Narcotic Farm, 60 acres out there, and they closed it down. And for a period of several months, they didn't use it for anything. So with the help of Jim Wright, we almost acquired that as a gift.
Is that right?
Yeah, we sure did. We sure did.
Well, now what happened? Why did?
Well, I don't really know what happened. It just cooled off. I really don't know what caused it or who caused it.
The feds had it.
Well, the
at
feds
first,
and
then they closed it down.
They owned it and closed it down and were doing nothing with it and saw no need to keep it.
But then evidently they did because they're back there. So.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. So something happened. In the meantime, they considered very strongly. We had several official meetings with some of the hierarchy from Washington. Came down and had conferences with Dr. Lubel and Dr. Hart and so forth. So like I say, this was all back in 1969, 1970.
Well, back in 1969, did you ever dream this place would look like this?
No, I really didn't. I really didn't. However, we dreamed it would look somewhat comparable. We had a local architect firm here that was the architect at the time and had drawn up some proposals about what the campus would be. Now, you shouldn't have asked me that question.
Or have you still got them?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Sure.
Great.
But I'm trying to think of the name of the firm. It's down on University Drive. But Snowden.
Okay.
Yeah.
That'd be an interesting thing to have in the archives. I'm glad we
Well, I've got it in the archives.
Yeah.
I really have.
What do you think 20 years from now the place will be like?
Oh, that's kind of hard to conceive. I don't. 20 years from now, you mean? Well, that'd be well into the 21st century, won't it? Well, it'll be here.
Yeah. Okay.
It'll be here.
That's something.
And I strongly feel like it'll still be an osteopathic institution. You know, there have been waves and that sort of thing about it being something else, but I don't think it will. It'll be an osteopathic institution.
Well, when are you going to retire?
I'm going to retire. I said that I was going to retire after the 1,000th graduate. But now I feel like I'm going to amend that.
That's real close.
Yeah, that's real close because we're within 11 now. 989. See, we've had that number to graduate. Now I think what I'll wait to do is I won't retire until after we've had 1,000 graduates practicing in the state of Texas.
Okay.
See, we got about 450 actually practicing in the state right now. So I'll wait till we get 1,000 to practice in the state, and I feel like that we're here to stay.
Yeah.
And 20 years from now, we will have something to be very proud of here on the Hill.
Yeah. Well, you've done your share to get us there. So
Well, thank you,
we
TK. I'm grateful for
And thank you for your reminiscing. It's worth a lot.
Well, I appreciate it. Let's see, this interview, I usually sit and ask the questions, like you're doing as I'm in charge of oral history, and I've interviewed everybody that had anything to do with the school, with one exception. I never got around to interviewing Dr. Danny Byer. Danny Byer was one of the founders. Yeah. He died, just a short time after I took the job as in the library, and so about 1981, something like that. I lined up to interview him, but I just never did quite make it. Yeah. So,
well, we would miss you if you left.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.